What would you do if the neighborhood's most power-hungry HOA enforcer tried to have your car towed, not knowing you actually own the towing company? This isn't just a story about petty revenge, it's about turning the tables so hard the entire HOA had to rewrite the rules. Stick around because it's about to get wild. Before we jump in, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love seeing this community grow. It all started on a warm Thursday morning when I was pulling into the neighborhood after a night shift at the shop. My eyes were gritty from lack of sleep, and all I wanted was to park my truck, drag myself inside, and crash for a few hours. As I turned the corner onto my street, I noticed a bright orange paper fluttering on my windshield. Even from the driver's seat, I could read the large block letters across the top. Parking violation. I sighed, killed the engine, and stepped out to grab it. The words were printed in a tone that was somehow both overly polite and dripping with judgment. Apparently, my truck was a visual blight when parked in front of my own house overnight. I knew exactly who had filed this report. Karen, my neighbor from 3 houses down, and the unofficial, self-appointed dictator of our HOA. She was notorious for patrolling the neighborhood like she was in a golf cart police unit, except she walked everywhere with a clipboard, a smug expression, and a camera phone ready to document any perceived offense. I crumpled the notice and tossed it in the passenger seat. This wasn't the first time Karen had tried to make a point, but I figured ignoring her would be the quickest way to make her lose interest. I was wrong. The next morning, I found her standing on my driveway when I came out to check the mail. She greeted me with that tight smile of hers, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. "We've had multiple complaints about your vehicle," she said. "The HOA rules are clear. Commercial-looking trucks should be stored out of sight." I stared at her for a second, still holding my coffee mug, trying to process how absurd this was. My truck was clean, not oversized, not plastered with any giant business logos, and it was legally registered and inspected. "It's just a pickup," I said flatly. "It's my personal vehicle." Karen tilted her head and gave me that pitying look she reserved for people she thought she was smarter than. "It's about neighborhood aesthetics. You understand." She didn't wait for my response before striding away like she'd just delivered a royal decree. For the next week, I parked in my driveway just to see if it would bother her less. It didn't. 2 more warning slips appeared, both citing slightly different sections of the HOA handbook. Each one was signed by Karen, as though she needed me to know exactly who was behind it. My friends started joking about it when they came over. "You've got a stalker with a badge." My buddy Mike laughed, but the constant pressure was starting to grate on me. On the 8th day after that first notice, I came home from a grocery run and saw Karen talking to a man in a reflective vest at the corner of my street. He was from a local towing company. I could feel my blood pressure spike. She was pointing toward my house, toward my truck. I didn't confront her right then, partly because I didn't trust myself to keep my cool, and partly because I wanted to see if she'd really take it that far. I didn't have to wait long. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of metal chains clinking and the low rumble of a diesel engine. I stepped out onto my porch, barefoot and half awake, just in time to see my truck already lifted onto the bed of a tow truck. My first reaction was disbelief. Karen stood on the sidewalk across the street, arms crossed, lips pursed in satisfaction like she'd finally won. I jogged down the steps and waved at the driver to stop. "Hey, that's my truck," I said. He checked his clipboard and shrugged. "Sorry, man." OA ordered the tow. "They've got authority here." Karen smirked and said, "It's already gone too far for you to argue now. You can pick it up at the yard and pay the fees." For a moment, I almost told her right there. Almost. But something in me decided to let this play out. I stepped back, raised my hands in mock surrender, and said, "All right, guess I'll have to do that." She blinked like she was surprised I wasn't putting up more of a fight. But she stayed quiet as the truck rolled away with my vehicle. I went back inside, poured myself another coffee, and called my office. The thing Karen didn't know, what almost nobody in the neighborhood knew, was that I wasn't just an employee at the towing company. I owned it. The whole operation, from the trucks to the impound lot to the office paperwork, was mine. When I started the business years ago, I never felt the need to brag about it to my neighbors. It wasn't a secret, but I liked keeping my personal life low-key. Now, that little bit of privacy was about to make this the most satisfying week of my life. When I called the yard manager, I didn't even have to explain much. "Hey Tony, did a pickup come in this morning from Maple Grove HOA?" He chuckled. "Yeah, a nice silver one. Says it belongs to some guy named..." He paused, clearly reading the form. "Oh, wait, that's your truck." I grinned and said, "Yup, park it in the private section. No release until I say so." Tony laughed again, already sensing I was up to something. By noon, Karen was pounding on my door. I opened it slowly, pretending to be groggy, as if she'd just woken me up from a nap. "Do you know how much it costs per day for storage?" she snapped. "If you don't go get your truck today, you'll be paying through the nose." I leaned against the doorframe and said, "Yeah, I'm aware." She hesitated, clearly thrown off by my calm tone. "Well, good. Then maybe you'll think twice before cluttering up the neighborhood with eyesores." She turned to leave, but I couldn't resist. "Oh, I'm thinking about it," I said, my voice low enough to make her pause. She looked back at me, searching my expression, but I kept it neutral. She left without another word. That night, I checked in with Tony again. Karen hadn't called the yard, which meant she assumed the towing company was just another faceless business. She had no idea she was playing directly into my hands. I sat at my kitchen table, sipping a beer, thinking about how this would unfold. The best revenge, I decided, wouldn't just be getting my truck back without paying a dime. No, I wanted her to realize exactly who she'd been messing with, and for the entire HOA to see it happen. The next morning, I got up early, threw on my company jacket with the logo on the chest, and drove one of our spare flatbeds into the neighborhood. Karen's face as she saw me behind the wheel was everything I'd hoped for and more. I stopped right in front of her house and leaned out the window with a cheerful, "Morning, Karen." She froze, eyes flicking from the truck to my jacket to my face. She didn't speak. I just smiled, waved and drove on toward my place, already planning the moment I'd let her in on the truth. The next day started with my phone buzzing on the counter before the sun was even up. It was Tony from the yard. "You're gonna love this," he said, his voice still thick with sleep. "Karen just called. Said she was the HOA president and that we had illegally towed your truck. Demanded we release it without fees. Said she'd be sending the police if we didn't comply." I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. "And what did you tell her?" Tony chuckled. "Told her she'd have to follow standard procedure and that storage fees were already adding up." I could picture the vein in her forehead throbbing as she heard that. She was the type who was used to winning arguments just by being louder. By mid-morning, she was on my porch again, this time with a manila folder clutched under her arm like it was evidence in a criminal trial. "You think this is funny?" she snapped the second I opened the door. I leaned casually on the frame and took a sip of coffee. "A little," I admitted. Her face darkened. "The HOA has authority to enforce community standards, and that includes vehicle removal. You're in violation, and until you pay the tow company and retrieve your truck, you're in breach of your homeowner agreement." She shoved a copy of the HOA rules at me, her finger jabbing at a highlighted section. I didn't look at the paper. Instead, I met her gaze and said, "You sure you want to keep pushing this?" She blinked, clearly not expecting me to challenge her so directly. "Absolutely," she said. "This isn't personal. It's about preserving property values." I smiled just enough to make her suspicious. "All right," I said. "Then we'll let it play out." I closed the door before she could respond, leaving her standing there fuming. That afternoon, I called an emergency meeting with my office staff. We were going to make sure this situation unfolded exactly the way I wanted it to. "No calls from her get routed to me," I told them. "If she asks about the owner, tell her he's unavailable and busy. And every day, make sure she knows those storage fees are climbing." My crew grinned like they'd just been told to pull off a heist. They'd all heard my stories about Karen over the years, and they were more than happy to help me turn the tables. The first cracks in her confidence showed the following morning. I was walking back from the mailbox when she approached me, a little less stiff than usual. "Look," she began, "maybe we can work something out. If you move your truck into your garage from now on, I might be able to convince the board to waive some of the fees." I tilted my head, pretending to think about it. "That's generous," I said. "But the garage is full, and honestly, I don't mind the fees." She squinted at me. "You don't mind?" she repeated, as if the concept was alien to her. "Not really," I said. "It's worth it to see how this all turns out." Her frustration was almost palpable. She was used to being the puppet master, but now she was pulling strings and nothing was moving. By the third day, I noticed her walking the neighborhood less. No clipboard, no camera phone ready to snap evidence. Word was starting to get around. Neighbors began stopping by to ask why she had it out for me, and I played it cool, telling them it was just a misunderstanding. I didn't need to badmouth her. The more vague I was, the more they'd fill in the blanks themselves. By the end of the week, Karen's composure was cracking in public. I heard from Mike that she'd been ranting at the last HOA meeting, saying the towing company was corrupt and the board should hire a lawyer. That was my cue. I decided the reveal needed to happen soon, but not before I pushed her just a little further. On Saturday morning, I had Tony draft a formal letter to the HOA. It outlined the fees due for the silver pickup impounded at the request of Ms. Karen, listing the growing total in bold at the bottom. I made sure the letterhead was crisp, the language professional, and the tone firm. I delivered it personally, sliding it into her mailbox where she'd see it before anything else that day. A couple of hours later, I heard her voice echoing down the street, yelling at someone over the phone. The next day, she cornered me in my driveway. "You think you're clever, don't you?" she hissed. I shrugged. "I think I'm patient," I said. "And I think maybe you didn't think this through." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "If you don't get that truck back today, I will have the HOA file a formal complaint with the city. You'll be fined on top of everything else." I kept my tone even. "Go for it." Her mouth opened like she was about to unleash another threat, but nothing came out. She just turned sharply and stormed away. I knew the reveal had to be timed perfectly. Too soon, and she'd just retreat into some excuse about it all being a misunderstanding. Too late, and the tension would fade. Monday morning, I called the HOA office and requested to attend the next board meeting. I told them it was about the towing incident and made sure Karen would be there. The meeting was set for Wednesday night. That gave me 2 days to make sure everything was in place. Tuesday evening, I stopped by the yard to check on my truck. It was spotless. Tony had it parked in the front lot, polished and gleaming under the floodlights. "Figured you'd want it looking sharp for the big show," he said with a grin. I nodded. "Perfect. Tomorrow, we bring it home." That night, I barely slept, running through the moment in my head over and over. The boardroom, Karen's smug expression turning to confusion, the whispers from the other members as I explained exactly who I was. I wanted it to land like a hammer, leaving no doubt that she had picked the wrong neighbor to mess with. When Wednesday came, I dressed in my company polo, clean jeans, and work boots. Nothing flashy, but enough to make the logo on my chest impossible to miss. I drove the flatbed into the neighborhood, right before the meeting, my truck secured on the back. As I passed Karen's house, I saw her at the window, phone in hand, probably calling someone to complain. I didn't stop. The board meeting was held in the small clubhouse at the entrance to the neighborhood. About 20 people were there, most of them curious residents. I walked in, nodded politely to the board, and took a seat near the front. Karen was across the table, papers neatly stacked, expression smug. She had no idea what was about to happen. When the board called the meeting to order, the room hummed with that mix of politeness and barely hidden curiosity that always shows up when neighbors think there might be drama to watch. I sat near the front because I wanted Karen to see me every time she looked up from her papers. She had arranged her folders into perfect stacks and kept touching the edges like she was ironing out wrinkles that only she could see. Across from us, the treasurer tapped a pen against a glass of water, and the secretary tried to get the projector to talk to an old laptop that should have retired years ago. I felt calm on the surface, but under that calm, there was a wire of energy as tight as a guitar string, because I knew what was coming, and I wanted every second of it to land. Before they got to new business, the president asked if there were any urgent concerns, and Karen's hand shot up so fast her chair squeaked across the tile. She stood with a little smile and said there was an issue of non-compliance that had escalated because a resident refused to follow guidelines and had forced the HOA to tow a vehicle to protect property values. Her voice carried like it had its own microphone. A couple of neighbors turned to look at me and then back at her as if watching a tennis match. I did not move. She clicked the remote, and the projector finally lit the wall with a slide deck that looked like a courtroom presentation. Photo 1 was my truck, parked curbside outside my own house. Photo 2 was the same truck at a different angle, in early morning light. Photo 3 was the tow truck, lifting it with neat green circles around the tires and red arrows pointing to the chains, like this was a crime scene. She narrated while the photos changed, and the words came out coated in sugar, but the message was the same as always. Rules are rules, and she was the guardian of them. She finished with a little flourish, where she requested the board authorize an additional fine for non-cooperation and approve legal counsel in case the resident attempted to contest the tow. The president nodded and opened the floor for comments. Hands went up. Mike raised his and asked whether the rules really applied to personal pickups that were not wrapped in advertisements. He said he could not find a section that covered what she was calling commercial appearance, and he said it with that polite tone that still cuts. Karen tilted her head and said, aesthetics guidelines gave the board broad discretion, and that she was simply acting on that. Another neighbor asked why she had not spoken directly with me before ordering the tow, and there was a little ripple of agreement, because everyone knew Karen liked writing notices more than conversations. She answered that she had approached me, and that I had been dismissive. I could have argued right then, but I let the silence stretch enough to make her glance at me again. That was my cue to stand. I thanked the board for letting me speak, and I kept my voice steady and plain. I said I wanted the record to be clear that my truck is personal and registered and legal, and that I had tried to comply by moving it to the driveway for a week, despite there being no rule that required it. I said I respected the idea of an HOA because shared standards keep things nice when they are applied fairly. I paused and let that land. Then I said the tow had caused real disruption, and that I would like to walk through the day it happened, so the board could decide whether it was necessary or if it was a misuse of authority. The president nodded for me to continue, and the room quieted in that way where even the old air conditioner seemed to listen. I took a breath and rolled the clock back aloud to that morning when chains clinked and a diesel engine idled outside my house. I told them how I came out barefoot with sleep still in my eyes and saw my truck already tilted up on the bed, and saw Karen standing on the sidewalk like a director calling the shots. I told them the driver said the HOA had ordered it, and that fees would start immediately, and that I had raised my hands and stepped back instead of arguing, because I wanted to avoid a scene on our quiet street. I told them I went inside and called the yard because I needed to know where my truck would be and how to get it back. Mike asked what the yard said, and I did not smile, even though I wanted to because the reveal was near. I said the yard confirmed receipt and put the vehicle in a private area awaiting owner authorization. Karen cut in to say that was standard and that I should have paid and retrieved it that day. The president asked her to let me finish, and she folded her arms but stayed quiet. I said that later that same morning Karen arrived at my door and told me storage fees would be crushing and that maybe I would learn to obey the rules now, and that I had nodded and wished her a nice day. Some people in the back coughed a laugh and then covered it with a fake throat clear. I said I had decided to let the situation develop because sometimes the fastest way to the truth is to hand someone their own rope and see how far they pull. The treasurer asked what I meant by that, and I leaned on the back of the chair in front of me and spoke with care. I said what I meant is that the tow was not about safety or blocked driveways or abandoned cars, but about control, and that the person who wanted control wanted the spectacle of a truck lifted in front of everyone more than they wanted a fair conversation. Karen said that was an accusation and out of line, and I said it was an observation, and we could look at the timeline if the board preferred data to opinions. The president asked me to keep going, so I did. I described the next days when Karen called the yard and threatened police action, and how the yard staff told her the policy was clear and that fees accrued daily. I described her visits to my porch with manila folders and highlighted passages that did not say what she thought they said. I described walking the neighborhood and hearing neighbors whisper about why the HOA would tow a truck that had caused no harm. At this point, I felt the room tilt toward me, the way a conversation tilts when people decide what they are hearing fits the shape of the facts they know in their bones. And because I wanted the story to stay true to the outline in my head, I pivoted and filled in details of the day itself that I had not shared yet. I said the driver doing the tow had asked if I wanted to photograph the vehicle before it left, and that I had done so because I know the business and know that cameras are better than memory when questions come up later. I said I had recorded the exact time and the positions of the tires and the lack of any signage that forbade parking on that side, and that I had saved those files. The secretary asked if I would be willing to provide them to the board, and I told her yes. Karen muttered that it would not matter, and that the rule was still the rule. A man in the third row asked which rule exactly, because he had the handbook on his phone and could not find the word commercial anywhere near pickups, and that practically every house on our street had one anyway. Karen said the point was neighborhood character, and that if we let one person break the spirit of the guideline, the whole standard collapses. I said the spirit of a guideline is not licensed to punish a neighbor for something you personally dislike. I let the silence hang for a beat, and then I decided it was time to stop circling and go straight through. I said there is another piece I want you all to have because transparency helps everyone, and because it explains why I chose patience over confrontation. I said the tow yard that received my truck is my yard and the company that sent the driver is my company, and that for the last several years I have run it quietly without making it a topic at block parties. The room did not gasp, but it shifted, and the sound of people rethinking what they had assumed is its own kind of wave. Karen blinked like a camera flashing twice in the wrong mode. She opened her mouth and then closed it and looked at her papers as if they could tell her what to say next. I kept my voice easy and said that I had chosen not to intervene the morning of the tow because I wanted to respect the process and protect the driver from an argument that should never be his to handle. I said I had not waived fees or cut corners because I wanted to see whether the board would recognize the overreach and correct it. I said that if the board determined the tow was improper, I would personally authorize the release of my truck, and I would zero the bill and document the event as a training case on how not to let an HOA dictate private business beyond its written authority. You could feel the energy spike again, but now it was not curiosity about gossip, but about resolution. The treasurer adjusted her glasses and asked whether the HOA had provided a signed tow authorization and whether it had included the specific rule number and the time window required for notice. I said yes to the first because Karen had indeed signed it, and no to the second because the citation section was vague and the notice window was skipped, and the tow was executed as an immediate enforcement when there was no documented hazard. The president looked toward Karen and asked her to explain the missing steps. Karen said that immediate action was warranted because the resident had been non-compliant for days and because her verbal warnings had been ignored. The secretary quietly said verbal warnings are not in the handbook as a substitute for written notice. A neighbor at the back said he watched the truck every day on his morning dog walks and there had been no hazard or obstruction, and that if the board allowed this kind of thing, we were all in trouble. The room murmured again. I felt the wire of energy inside me loosen a notch. The president called a brief recess so the board could review the documents and the handbook without a crowd pressing at them. While they conferred, I stepped outside into the mild evening and let the air smooth the edge off my nerves. The flatbed I had driven sat at the curb with my truck shining on the back like a promise. Tony texted me a thumbs up and asked if I was ready for the finale, and I texted back to stand by. When we were called back in, the president cleared his throat and said the board appreciated neighbor participation and wanted to proceed carefully. He said preliminary review showed the tow authorization lacked the required citation, and that written notice had not been provided in the timeline stated in the handbook. He said the board would move to suspend enforcement actions related to my vehicle until a proper review concluded, and he recommended that the yard release the truck to prevent further friction in the community. Karen started to protest, but the treasurer spoke up and said the board could not support costs born of a flawed process, and that it was time to reset with clarity rather than escalate. I nodded once and said I would authorize release immediately, and that there would be no storage bill for the HOA or for me, and that I would provide the photos and call logs so the board had a full record for the review. People exhaled in that synchronized way. Crowds do without planning. Mike clapped once and then realized no one else had started yet and grinned and clapped again, and then others joined, and the sound filled the room with relief. Karen sat very still and watched it happen like it was rain she had not predicted. When the meeting adjourned, I stepped outside and climbed into the flatbed and rolled slowly to the clubhouse entrance where neighbors had gathered with their phones up, not as a mob but as witnesses to the return of something simple and right. I lowered the bed and eased my truck down, and the cables sang a little metallic song and the tires kissed the pavement, and I shut off the winch and let the silence hold for a second. I walked to Karen because I wanted to give her one last chance to turn this into a lesson she could learn from, instead of a grudge she would feed. I said, I am going to park in my driveway tonight, and if you would like to discuss reasonable guidelines, I am happy to join a committee to help write them with the whole neighborhood invited. She stared at the truck and then at me and said, this is not over, and I said it can be over in the best way if you let it. Her jaw tightened, and she walked past me toward her car without another word. I got in my truck, and the seat felt like home, and the engine came alive, and for a second I just listened to it and let the relief wash through me. Neighbors waved as I drove slowly down the lane and turned into my driveway, and parked where this whole thing started, and I shut it off and sat with my hands on the wheel, and thought about the next move because power hates losing and Karen had built her identity on never losing. I knew the backlash was coming like thunder after lightning. But for one night the street was quiet and the porch lights were warm and the air smelled like cut grass, and I slept hard for the first time in a week. Morning would bring the fallout and the phone calls and maybe another notice on fancy paper, but I had something stronger than all of that now, because the board had seen the story with their own eyes, and the neighborhood had watched the ending roll off a flatbed and touch the ground, and you cannot unsee something that clear. I poured coffee in the kitchen at sunrise, and the cup steamed like a small promise, and my phone buzzed with 3 messages from numbers I did not recognize, and I smiled because the next chapter was already knocking and I was wide awake. Open the door. The first call came before I even finished my first cup of coffee. It was the HOA president sounding cautious but polite, asking if I had a moment to talk. I told him I did, and he explained that after last night's meeting, a few board members were already getting emails from residents who wanted to revisit several enforcement practices. He said this wasn't just about my truck anymore. It was about whether the HOA had allowed personal biases to influence decisions. I could hear the weight in his voice. It was the sound of someone realizing the ground under them was softer than they thought. He asked if I would consider attending a special session to help draft clearer guidelines, and I said I would. Not because I wanted to be the guy who rewrote the rules, but because it was the best way to make sure no one else got hit with the kind of stunt Karen pulled on me. The second call was Tony. He was laughing before I even picked up. Apparently, Karen had called the yard again this morning, demanding to know if she could get a written statement claiming the tow was valid. Tony told her the owner had already authorized the release and closed the ticket. When she pressed for the owner's name, he said she already knew it and hung up. I told him to ignore any more calls from her, and he said gladly. The third message was a text from a number I didn't recognize. It read, "You don't know who you're dealing with." No name. No punctuation. Just that. I stared at it for a few seconds and set my phone down. Karen wasn't subtle, and I doubted anyone else in the neighborhood cared enough to send that sort of thing. It was almost funny. Almost. By mid-morning, I stepped outside to find Karen standing on the sidewalk across from my driveway. She wasn't holding her clipboard. She was holding a phone angled low, as if she were pretending not to record, but clearly was. I waved. She didn't wave back. Instead, she called out, "I hope you enjoyed your little show last night." I leaned against my truck and said it wasn't a show. It was a meeting, and you were part of it. Her jaw flexed, and she said, "You humiliated me in front of everyone." I said no. The facts did that. She stepped forward a little and said, "You think this is over, but you don't know how these things work." I told her I knew exactly how they worked because I'd just watched it happen in real time. Then I climbed into my truck and drove off before she could answer. At the shop that day, I kept busy with paperwork, but part of my mind stayed on the neighborhood. This wasn't just Karen being angry. This was Karen regrouping. And people like her didn't sit still for long. They looked for angles, ways to win back the ground they'd lost. When I got home late that afternoon, there was an envelope taped to my front door. It was from the HOA. Inside was a formal notice that an anonymous complaint had been filed, claiming my truck leaked oil onto the street. I almost laughed out loud. The driveway under my truck was spotless, but it was obvious what was going on. If she couldn't get me on one rule, she'd try another. I took photos of the driveway from every angle, just to be safe. I even slid a sheet of clean cardboard under the engine overnight. The next morning, it was as clean as when I'd put it there. I emailed the photos to the HOA president with a short note explaining there was no leak and that I believed this was another targeted complaint. He replied within an hour saying he'd already suspected as much and that they would be looking into the source of the complaints. That afternoon, Mike stopped by. He leaned on the fence and said, "Half the neighborhood is talking about you and Karen." I told him I figured as much. He said people are starting to realize she's been pulling this kind of thing for years. Little stuff, mostly, but enough to keep everyone in line. I said, "That's what bullies do." Mike grinned and said, "Yeah, but now she's got someone pushing back." The following day, I got another envelope. This one wasn't a complaint. It was an invitation to the special session the president had mentioned. It was set for the weekend and was open to any resident who wanted to suggest changes to the enforcement process. I knew Karen wouldn't miss it, and I knew she'd try to spin it as an attack on her authority. So I spent the next 2 nights putting together something simple, not a flashy presentation, just clear examples of rules as written next to how they'd been applied in certain cases. I made sure one of those examples was my own case, but I left my name off it. I wanted people to judge the actions, not the personalities. When Saturday came, the clubhouse was packed. More people than I'd seen at any HOA meeting in years. The president opened by saying the purpose was to make enforcement consistent and transparent. Karen raised her hand almost immediately and launched into a speech about how relaxing the rules would lead to chaos. She painted a picture of rusted cars on cinder blocks and uncut lawns and declining property values. She was good at fear. But fear only works until someone points out the difference between what's real and what's imagined. When it was my turn, I stood and handed out copies of my examples. I walked the room through each one slowly. No sarcasm. No heat. Just facts and dates and the language of the rules. I asked people to consider whether they'd want a neighbor treated the same way, if the situation were theirs. I saw heads nodding. Even people who had been silent at the last meeting were speaking up now. One woman told a story about being warned for planting flowers that weren't on the approved list. Another man said he'd been told to move his work trailer, even though he had permission from the previous board. The more they spoke, the smaller Karen seemed in her chair. By the end of the session, the president proposed forming a new compliance committee that would review complaints before any action was taken. It would require evidence. It would require a written rule to be cited. And the person accused would get a chance to respond before anything happened. The motion passed with nearly every hand in the room raised. Karen didn't raise hers. She just stared straight ahead. When it was over and people were filing out, she walked up to me. Her smile was thin. She said, "You think you've won something?" I said, "I think we all did." She said, "This isn't finished." I said, "That's up to you." Then I stepped past her into the sunlight, feeling like maybe, just maybe, the neighborhood had turned a corner. But I knew her well enough to know that corners were just opportunities for another ambush. That night I sat on my porch with a beer listening to the quiet street. My truck was parked in the driveway right where it belonged. The air was cooler than it had been in weeks. Somewhere down the block a dog barked twice, then stopped. For the first time since this started, I let myself believe that maybe I could live here without checking over my shoulder every time I stepped outside. Then my phone buzzed. No name. No message. Just a photo. It was my truck taken from across the street in the dark. And I knew without a doubt that whatever came next was already in motion. The photo sat on my screen like a dare, and for a minute I just watched the pixels as if they could tell me what would happen next. I zoomed in and checked the angle and the reflection of the street lamp on the hood, and figured whoever took it was crouched near the hedge across the road. I stepped outside with a flashlight and played the beam across the grass where I thought the photographer had been, and found nothing but flattened blades and a cigarette butt, still warm at the tip. I took a picture of that too, then pocketed it and locked the truck, even though I knew a lock was not what this was about. This was about testing my nerves. I went back in and sent the photo and the cigarette picture to the HOA president with a short note, asking him to log it against the anonymous complaints, and I sent a copy to the non-emergency police line because sometimes a little daylight keeps small things from growing teeth. I barely slept, and when I did, I dreamed of chains clinking and a camera shutter clicking in the dark. At dawn, I brewed coffee and stood at the window watching the street the way a night guard watches a door that jiggled once. Mike texted asking if everything was cool, and I told him about the photo, and he said he'd swing by before work. He showed up with a bag of donuts and a small box that made me smile because I knew what it was before he opened it. 2 motion cameras and a handful of mounts. We put one above my garage and one on the maple facing the road, and aimed their cones to overlap like crossed arms. We tested the feeds on my phone until the picture looked clean and the motion alerts chirped a neat little tone. I headed to the shop and kept the day rolling, but by lunch my mind drifted back to the neighborhood and I called Tony to check in. He said the yard was quiet. He also said Karen had called again, asking for a sworn statement that the truck had been an obstruction, and again he told her the ticket was closed, and any statements had to be requested in writing with a fee for records. He said she hung up without a goodbye. He asked if I wanted him to pull the phone recordings just in case, and I said yes. We keep them for training, and sometimes training starts with an example of how not to talk to people. When I got home that evening, the cameras had caught an alley cat and a jogger and nothing else. I felt my shoulders drop half an inch, and I was ready to let the day go when an HOA email pinged my inbox. The subject line was Enforcement Process Clarifications, and the body was a short message from the president explaining the new review steps and the complaint form that would replace anonymous emails. It went to the whole neighborhood. He thanked the residents who had come to the session and reminded everyone that fairness mattered more than speed. I read it twice and felt that small satisfaction that comes from watching a tiny reform take root. A minute later, I got a separate email from him asking whether I would be willing to join the compliance committee officially. I told him yes, with one condition, that decisions would be transparent and records accessible to any resident who asked. He agreed almost immediately. The next morning, a motion alert pinged at 5 a.m., and I woke like a shot, but when I looked, it was just the newspaper guy tossing bundles from his old sedan. At 7, another alert pinged, and this time it was Karen walking past, slow with her phone at her side, angled just enough to catch my driveway in the corner of the frame. She looked up at the camera, and her mouth did a small twist before she kept going. No clipboard. No smile. She was adjusting to a world that pushed back. At noon, my office line lit up with a number that belonged to a neighboring HOA, not ours, and the caller said they had a vehicle blocking a hydrant and asked how fast we could respond. We dispatched a driver, and I went along because it felt good to do the work that runs under the drama like a steady river. At the scene, a sedan hugged a red curb, and the hydrant was barely visible behind its bumper. We documented everything and gently moved it without a scratch. As we loaded up, I heard a familiar voice on the sidewalk and turned to see Karen talking to a woman I recognized from our street. I had not noticed them arrive. I could not hear the words, but I saw Karen gesture toward me in the truck and the woman's face change as she put the pieces together. Karen caught my eye, and for a second there was a calculation there, as if she was trying to figure a new route that still led to the same destination. That night I sat on my porch steps and watched the sky turn the color of old peaches, and I made a decision that had been knocking for days. I would take the reveal out of rooms and emails and put it in the open where there was no stage light to pretend by. I posted a calm message to the neighborhood forum, thanking everyone who came to the session and linking to the new complaint form, and at the end I added a simple line for the sake of transparency that I was the owner of the towing company, referenced at the meeting, and that in any case involving our neighborhood I would recuse myself from direct action to avoid conflicts, and that recordings and photos would be available to any resident on request. I hit send and waited. The replies started slow, then stacked. Most were supportive, some neutral. 1 or 2 suspicious, in that way people get when they think a person with tools must be looking for nails. Then Karen posted. She wrote that it was inappropriate for a business owner to influence HOA policy and suggested I had used my position to orchestrate a personal stunt. I answered once with patience and facts, and then I stopped because I know how online fights spiral and because I wanted neighbors to judge by how we behaved, not how long we could type. The board president chimed in to clarify the process changes had been a board decision, and that my case had revealed gaps that could affect anyone. That settled the thread for the moment. 2 days passed with a quiet so normal it felt like borrowed time. Then a motion alert chimed just after midnight, and the camera showed a figure in a hoodie walking along the curb. The person paused at my driveway and bent down near the front tire, then walked away. I was out the door in seconds with a flashlight and a calm that felt practiced. At the tire I found 3 drywall screws scattered near the tread, and I laughed softly because it was clumsy and desperate and lazy all at once. I snapped photos and called the non-emergency line and filed a report, and then texted the HOA president again to add to the log. The officer who came by took a look at the video and shook his head and said some people cannot stand losing in the sunlight and try the shadows instead. He said to keep the cameras rolling and let him know if anything else happened. The next morning I brought coffee to Mike as a thank you for the cameras, and we watched the clip together on my phone. He pointed out the walk and the way the person favored a knee, and he said that gate looked familiar, but he would not guess names because guesses turn neighbors into enemies fast. He suggested I host a small cookout as a pressure valve because the neighborhood had been all talk and no laughs for weeks. I liked the idea. I posted a quick invite for Saturday with hot dogs and lemonade, and open conversation for anyone who wanted to talk about the new rules or anything else. A surprising number of people said they were in. Saturday afternoon, the street smelled like charcoal and spices, and kids chalked galaxies on the sidewalk, while adults found reasons to smile that were not about policy. I kept the drinks cold and the music low and stayed available without making it a forum. At one point, the HOA president stopped by with his spouse and thanked me for bringing people together, and said the committee had its first formal complaint submitted under the new process, and it was handled smoothly in a day with a simple warning and no tow. That felt like progress. Karen showed up late, wearing a careful smile and carrying a tray of store-bought cookies with a tag that said, "Community treat." She handed them to a kid and then made a slow circle until she found me. We stood 4 feet apart like chess pieces that know their moves, and she said, "I see you are quite the organizer now." I said I am just a neighbor who likes a good cookout. She said, "I hope you have permission for all these cars on the street," and for a second I thought she would pull a measuring tape from thin air. I told her we had checked the rules and everyone was parked legally, and then I asked if she wanted a plate. She declined and said I had painted her as a villain and that people were turning on her and that all she had ever done was try to keep the neighborhood nice. I told her the neighborhood could be nice without fear and that maybe she could help that happen if she listened more and cited rules less. Her smile thinned and she walked away, but not before glancing at the cameras on my eaves like they were staring back at her. As the sun dipped, the last guests drifted home, and I stood at the curb rolling up a hose when a car I did not recognize slowed near my driveway, and a window rolled down just enough for a voice to slide out telling me to watch where I park. That shiny truck, because accidents happen. I walked toward the car with my phone recording and asked the driver to repeat that, and the car pulled away fast and turned the corner before the camera could catch more than a partial plate. I logged it anyway. Then I sat on the porch and let the quiet back in and tried not to rehearse 10 different responses to something that might never happen. Monday afternoon, the compliance committee held its first official meeting, and I arrived early with a folder of blank forms and a pen that writes the first time you ask it to. 2 other volunteers joined, plus the treasurer, and we walked through the process step by step so that we could run it with our eyes closed if needed. Halfway through, the door opened, and Karen stepped in with a single sheet of paper and said she had a complaint to file and she wanted it reviewed immediately. She handed it to the treasurer, who read it quietly and then passed it to me. It was a claim that my truck had been parked within 5 feet of a driveway and that the resident could not safely exit and that the situation had persisted for 3 days. The form included a photo taken at night where perspective played tricks and curbs looked closer than they were. I felt a small flare of heat and put it out before it grew, because process protects everyone, even when a claim is clearly a jab. We thanked her and told her we would review evidence and respond the next day. She said she expected a tow if the violation was confirmed, and her eyes cut to me like a blade. We pulled my camera footage for the 3 nights and cross-referenced the street measurements and the plat map distance from my driveway to the neighbor's apron, and I measured that curb like a surveyor until there was no doubt left. 7 feet 5 inches at the tightest point. Clear and legal. I wrote a short response that said the complaint did not meet the standard for action and included 3 still images with timestamps and a daylight photo of the same spot with a tape measure visible. The committee approved the response and sent it within the hour. Minutes later, a response arrived from Karen, accusing me of tampering with evidence and of using my cameras to intimidate residents. The treasurer wrote back that the cameras were on my property and that evidence from any source, including complainants, would be reviewed equally, and that baseless accusations would be noted in the file. It was polite but firm in the way a door can be closed without a slam. I thought that might cool things down, but the next evening a tow truck I did not recognize rolled slowly into the subdivision, and my phone lit up with 3 texts from neighbors asking if I had called it for someone. I had not. I stepped outside and saw the truck idling by the clubhouse and recognized the logo from across town, a small operator who sometimes took overflow from big apartments where managers wanted quick clears. I walked over and asked the driver who had called him, and he said he had an authorization from the HOA for immediate removal of a vehicle obstructing a fire lane near the pool. I asked to see the authorization, and he showed me a barely filled form with a signature that looked like Karen's and no rule citation, and no address, just pool parking lot written across the top. I told him calmly that our HOA required a board-approved process now, and that this form would not protect him if the tow was challenged, and that he was about to become the star of a video he did not want posted anywhere. He looked at the clubhouse where 3 residents had already pulled out phones, and he made a smart choice and put his truck in gear and left without touching a single car. I documented the form number and texted the president a photo with a note asking for guidance. Within 30 minutes he replied that no such tow had been authorized and that the board would address the attempted action at once. The next morning an email went to the neighborhood stating that only the compliance committee could initiate enforcement actions and that any attempts to bypass the process would result in board review and potential removal from duties where applicable. It did not name Karen, but it did not need to. The street felt like a kettle right before the whistle. I trimmed hedges and cleaned tools and tried not to count down the minutes to the inevitable knock. It came late afternoon, hard enough to rattle the glass. I opened the door to find Karen on my step with her phone recording, and a small crowd across the street pretending to check mail. She said loudly that I had sabotaged a lawful tow, and that I was using my business to intimidate vendors, and that she would be filing a complaint with the city and the state and anyone who would listen. I told her the vendor had made his own decision after reviewing a deficient form, and that fairness is not intimidation. I said the board had affirmed the new process, and that we were all bound by it, and that if she wanted to file with the city she should include the part where she tried to bypass her own procedures. Her mouth tightened, and she told the camera that corruption was alive and well on Maple Grove, and that she would not rest until order was restored. I let her finish, then I said something I had been holding since the first orange slip. I said order without fairness is just control, wearing a nicer shirt, and that this neighborhood is not a stage for anyone's need to feel powerful. She dropped the phone to her side, and for a heartbeat we were just 2 people on a porch with a history neither of us had asked for. Then she turned and walked away, and the small crowd dissolved like sugar in hot tea. As dusk settled, I sat on the tailgate of my truck and watched porch lights blink on one by one, and thought about the shape of the next day. The board had scheduled a censure discussion for the following evening, and I knew it would either cool the street or light it brighter. I felt tired, but not afraid. The cameras blinked a little green and my phone buzzed with a message from the president asking if I would attend to answer questions about procedures, and I told him yes. I closed the garage and listened to the door, roll down smooth and even, and I said out loud to the empty space that tomorrow was for answers, and after that we all got to choose who we wanted to be on this block. The next evening, the clubhouse lights were already glowing when I pulled into the lot, and I could see silhouettes moving behind the windows. The air was thick and still, like the minutes before a storm, and I knew there were people inside who had been rehearsing their lines all day. I walked in with my folder under one arm and nodded to a few neighbors who looked my way. Some smiled. Some didn't. Karen was at the far end of the table wearing a sharp blazer like this was a deposition and not a community meeting. Her phone was set up on a small tripod angled toward the board, and I could tell from the red dot it was already recording. The president opened by stating the purpose of the meeting was to review an incident involving an unauthorized tow request and to determine if disciplinary action was necessary. His tone was calm but carried that edge you get when you're tired of dancing around something. He asked the treasurer to read the incident report, and she did without looking up from the page. It laid out the timeline from the moment the tow truck entered the neighborhood to when it left without removing any vehicle. It noted the incomplete authorization form and the lack of a cited rule, and the fact that the compliance committee had not been consulted. When she finished, the president asked if the person who submitted the form would like to explain. Karen sat straighter and folded her hands on the table. She said she had been acting in good faith to prevent a dangerous obstruction near the pool, and that she had not believed there was time to wait for committee review. She said she thought her position as HOA vice president allowed her to authorize urgent action. The secretary spoke up and said the bylaws did not support that interpretation and that even urgent cases had a clear two-step process. Karen replied that rules sometimes had to bend to protect safety. I kept my mouth shut because this was a moment for the board to speak to itself before anyone else stepped in. The president turned to me and asked if I could explain what happened from the vendor's perspective. I stood and kept my voice even. I said the driver was presented with an incomplete form and asked to remove a vehicle without a specific address and without photographic evidence of the obstruction. I said the driver called me for guidance, and I advised him that the HOA had a new enforcement process and that the form he had been given did not meet that standard. I said he chose to leave without touching any vehicle to avoid a dispute that could have legal consequences for his company. I added that no cars were blocking the fire lane when I arrived to speak with him. Karen cut in to say that was just my word, and I said it wasn't because 3 residents had video of the scene and had shared it with the board. The president confirmed the videos matched my account. That put a stillness in the room, the kind that comes when facts land heavier than opinions. The treasurer made a motion to censure Karen for bypassing the process and attempting to authorize a tow without proper review. The secretary seconded it. Karen's eyes moved from one board member to another looking for a crack, but no one spoke up. The president opened the motion for discussion, and a man in the audience stood to say he had lived here 12 years and had never seen an HOA rule change happen so quickly until the compliance committee was formed. He said it was working and it needed to be respected. A woman followed, saying she had been nervous about speaking against Karen before, but the events of the last month made it clear no one person should act alone on enforcement. The words were polite, but the weight behind them was not. When the vote came, it was 3 in favor and 1 abstention. The president announced that Karen would be removed from all enforcement duties, and any future complaints she submitted would go directly to the compliance committee for review like any other resident. Her jaw tightened, and she leaned back in her chair without saying a word. After the meeting broke up, a few neighbors came over to shake my hand or clap my shoulder. I kept my answers short, because I knew she was watching from across the room. I didn't want to give her anything she could twist later. When I stepped outside, the air was cooler and the parking lot was mostly empty except for a few cars under the street lamp. I walked to my truck and spotted Karen standing by her car with the phone still recording. She said, "This isn't about rules for you, is it?" I told her it was always about rules and about fairness and about making sure no one else had to deal with what I did. She shook her head like I had missed some point, only she understood and got in her car without another word. I drove home slow through the neighborhood, watching porch lights glow in windows and cats slip between yards. When I parked, I left the engine running for a moment, just listening to it and thinking how quiet things might finally be. Inside, I set my folder down and made a late sandwich. Halfway through, eating my phone buzzed with a motion alert. It was the Maple camera picking up a shadow moving along the curb. The figure passed out of frame in less than 3 seconds. No clear face. Just the faint shape of a hood and the glint of something in a hand. I saved the clip and checked the driveway. Everything was untouched. Still, it was a reminder that quiet wasn't the same as peace. The next morning, the president called and thanked me for staying calm during the meeting. He said the board would send a formal notice to all residents about the censure and remind them that enforcement authority was now committee only. He also said off the record that he didn't expect Karen to take this without some kind of pushback. I told him I was ready for whatever came next. Later that day at the shop, one of my drivers told me a woman had come by asking for a quote to remove a certain truck from a private driveway. He said she wouldn't give her name but described her as sharp-voiced and wearing sunglasses inside. I asked if she left any contact info and he said no. It was sloppy and desperate, and I didn't even have to guess who it was. I told the crew to call me directly if anyone tried something like that again. By evening, I decided to get ahead of whatever she was planning. I printed a stack of flyers for the compliance committee with clear steps for filing a complaint and examples of valid and invalid submissions. I walked them door to door, smiling and chatting and leaving each one in a mailbox or hand to hand. It was neighborly, and it was also armor, because the more people knew the rules, the harder it would be for anyone to twist them. As I rounded the corner back toward my place, I saw Karen on her porch watching me. She didn't say anything, just leaned on the railing like she was calculating something. I raised a hand in a casual wave and kept walking. When I reached my driveway, the cameras caught her stepping down from the porch and walking to her mailbox, where she pulled out the flyer and read it slowly before crumpling it in her fist. That night I sat in the garage with the door open, enjoying the mild air. The street was quiet, but the quiet felt like a coin balanced on its edge. It could fall either way. I knew this wasn't the last round. But I also knew that every step she took outside the rules from here on out would be that much easier to prove. I shut the garage and went inside, feeling the mix of readiness and weariness that comes when you've been in a fight long enough to see its shape but not its end. 2 days after the censure meeting, the neighborhood felt different. Not calmer exactly, but more watchful. People who used to wave in passing now slowed to chat at the curb, asking how the committee worked or if their paint color counted as approved. I answered each question patiently because every conversation was another brick in the wall against the kind of snap decisions Karen had been making for years. Still, I could feel her somewhere in the background moving pieces. The first sign came in the form of a thick envelope in my mailbox. Inside was a letter from a local attorney representing an unnamed client, claiming I had engaged in harassment and intimidation of HOA leadership, and that if it continued, they would seek a restraining order. It was written to sound official, but the lack of details gave it away as something meant to scare, not to stand up in court. I called the number on the letter and got a voicemail that belonged to a small firm downtown. I left a short message saying I would be happy to respond once I knew what the allegations were and that I expected a written complaint by the end of the week. That evening, Mike came by with a six-pack and a look that said he had news. Apparently, Karen had been telling people at the coffee shop that I was using my towing company to threaten anyone who disagreed with me. He said she even suggested I might tow cars without permission and hide behind the HOA rules as cover. It was absurd, but rumors have their own strange gravity. I told him I'd keep documenting everything, and he said he'd keep his ears open. The next morning, a motion alert woke me at 4:18 a.m. The camera caught a dark SUV, slowing in front of my driveway before speeding off. The plate was partially visible, but not enough for a match. I saved the clip and added it to the growing file of odd visits. By mid-morning, I had an email from the president saying a resident had tried to submit a complaint about my truck being oversized for residential streets, but the form was rejected because it didn't cite a rule. He didn't name the resident, but I didn't have to guess. I spent that afternoon at the shop clearing old invoices and doing what I could to keep my mind off the neighborhood politics. But when I got home, a folded note was tucked under my doormat. It said in block letters, "You're not welcome here." No signature. The cameras hadn't caught the delivery, so whoever left it knew where the blind spots were. I adjusted both cameras that night, widening their coverage until the motion zones overlapped completely. The compliance committee met again 2 days later to review a landscaping complaint unrelated to me. We resolved it in under 15 minutes, and the treasurer mentioned the board had been approached by 2 separate residents wanting to run for open positions at the next election. That was unusual in a place where seats often went uncontested. I wondered if Karen saw that as her path back to influence. On Friday, a letter arrived from the attorney I had called earlier. It repeated the claim of harassment but again had no specific incidents listed. I took it to my own attorney, who read it twice and shook his head. He said it was a bluff designed to make me flinch, and that the lack of dates or actions made it worthless in court. He offered to send a response demanding details, and I told him to do it. That weekend I worked in the yard trimming hedges and resealing the deck while neighbors walked past with waves and small talk. Karen didn't appear until late afternoon when she came down the sidewalk with a small dog. I'd never seen her walk before. She stopped just outside my driveway and said the board was going to regret tying their process to someone like me. I asked her what she meant, and she said I'd see soon enough. Then she walked on without looking back. Sunday night, the Maple camera pinged at 11:40, 2 p.m. It caught a person crouching near my mailbox and sliding something inside. I went out as soon as I saw it, but the street was empty. Inside the mailbox was a single printed page with an unflattering photo of me speaking at the HOA meeting and a caption that read, "This man wants to control our neighborhood." The same page was taped to 3 other mailboxes on my street. I took them down and kept them as evidence. The next morning I sent the photos and the video still to the president. He said the board would address it at the next meeting. By Tuesday, the flyers had sparked more conversation than outrage. Several neighbors told me directly they thought it was childish. One even said it made them more likely to support me on the committee because it showed how petty some opposition had become. Karen didn't post on the neighborhood forum all week, which was unusual. I figured she was regrouping again. Then Thursday afternoon, the board called an emergency session and asked me to attend. When I walked in, I saw a stack of printed complaints on the table, each one nearly identical. They claimed I was using the committee to block enforcement against my friends and target those who supported Karen. The treasurer said they had all been submitted within 2 hours of each other, and most came from people who had never filed a complaint before. It didn't take long to connect the dots. The president said they would be investigated, but that the sudden cluster raised questions about coordination. I asked if I should recuse myself from the committee while it was reviewed, and he said no. That stepping back would look like guilt. That night, Mike and I sat on my porch with the camera's feed pulled up on my phone. He pointed to the list of alerts from the last week and said she was trying to wear me down until I slipped. I told him I wasn't slipping, but I was tired. He suggested a neighborhood walk to check in with people face to face instead of through the forum. I agreed, and we started planning it for Saturday morning. When Saturday came, we covered almost every block. We asked how people felt about the new complaint process, and most said they liked it. A few said they stayed out of HOA stuff completely, but appreciated that it seemed calmer. One older resident told me she had stopped parking her car on the street because she was afraid of being targeted and thanked me for standing up to the nonsense. By the time we got back to my place, I felt lighter. The noise of rumors felt smaller when you saw the real people living their lives. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the houses, a black sedan I didn't recognize parked 2 houses down. 2 people got out and walked toward Karen's place carrying folders. They stayed inside almost an hour. When they left, they didn't look my way, but one of them glanced up at the Maple camera and smiled before getting in the car. The plate was clear this time, and I wrote it down. Sunday morning, I got a text from the president asking if I knew anything about a petition to recall 2 board members. I didn't. He said the petition claimed the new enforcement process was slowing down action and hurting property values. He also said Karen's name was on it, along with a handful of residents who had filed those identical complaints. It would take a majority of homeowners to succeed, which was unlikely but not impossible. I told him I'd keep talking to people and make sure they understood what was really happening. By late afternoon, I had already spoken with a dozen neighbors, and most were against the recall. They didn't want to go back to the old way. Still, the fact that Karen had moved from complaints to an organized petition meant she wasn't just fighting me anymore. She was trying to undo everything the committee had built. And if she couldn't get me out, she'd try to change the rules back so she could operate the way she always had. That night, I sat at my desk with the petition news fresh in my head and started drafting a simple timeline of the last 2 months. Not just for me, but for anyone who needed to see it, laid out from the first warning slip to the censure meeting to the flyers and now the recall attempt. I kept it factual, and left out every insult and rumor. When it was done, I printed copies and sealed them in envelopes, ready to hand out if the petition started making real traction. Before bed, I stepped onto the porch and looked at the street. It was quiet under the street lamps. The cameras blinked green and steady. I knew the next HOA meeting would be the real test, because petitions thrive on momentum, and momentum lives in rooms where people think no one is paying attention. I planned to make sure they knew I was paying attention, and that every step would be documented just like the last ones. The week of the recall meeting started with a grey morning and the sound of a mower 3 houses down. I stood at the kitchen counter running through the timeline I had printed and sealed in envelopes, and I kept thinking about momentum, how it gathers around the loudest voice unless someone steadies the room. I called the president and told him I planned to attend with my documentation, and he said to bring anything factual that could help neighbors understand what had actually happened since the first tow. He sounded tired but steady. He said he expected a crowd. I said good crowds love daylight. Mike dropped by that afternoon and we walked the block talking to people who had signed the petition and people who had refused. Most of the signatures we asked about came with a shrug or a quick explanation that they thought it was just to have a vote not to remove anyone yet. That told me something important. The petition was packaged as a harmless temperature check, but it was written as a demand. I asked one neighbor if he had a copy of what he signed, and he said no, the person with the clipboard kept it. When I asked who that person was, he glanced down the street toward Karen's place and then away again. That night I sat at my desk and wrote a 1-page summary in plain language. No flair, just facts. I explained the new process, the reason for it, the censure, the attempted unauthorized tow, and the flyers and the identical complaints and the petition language. I added the note that a recall could raise dues if it forced legal review and special meetings, and that the board had not raised dues in 3 years because costs were stable. When I was done, I read it out loud to hear where it tripped, and then I read it again, slower, until the rhythm felt right. The day before the meeting, the cameras caught 2 people canvassing in the evening carrying clipboards. One was Karen. The other was the same person I had seen get out of that black sedan earlier in the week. They moved fast, house to house, and at each door Karen did the talking while the other person nodded and pointed to a line on the paper. I did not interrupt. I just logged it with timestamps. The morning of the meeting I brewed coffee and felt the weight of the day settle into my shoulders like a tool belt I knew how to wear. I called Tony and asked him to have the recordings of Karen's calls to the yard ready in case the board wanted to hear them. Not to shame her, but to show how the tow had been pushed through without process. He said he had them clipped and labeled with dates. I took a breath and thanked him. The clubhouse parking lot was full 20 minutes before start time. People stood outside in loose knots, talking low. When I walked in, I felt eyes follow me, and I kept my expression open and my steps even. The board sat at the front table with a stack of papers and a long sign in sheet. Karen stood near the podium, speaking with the same 2 visitors in business casual who had joined her earlier. I recognized the logo on one of their folios, a consulting group that specialized in association management. That meant she was preparing to argue procedure with the weight of outside voices. It also meant she expected a fight on the merits. The president opened the meeting and explained the recall process in clear steps. He said the petition would be verified, and then residents would have a chance to speak for and against before any vote. He asked for civility and patience. Then he invited the petition organizer to present the case. Karen stepped up with a stack of papers and a calm she wore like armor. She said the neighborhood had suffered under inconsistent enforcement for too long, and that the new process had caused delays that threatened safety and property values. She pointed to a chart showing response times to complaints over the last month and said they had increased. Her consultant stepped forward to talk about best practices and the need for decisive leadership. They tried to wrap the conversation in the language of efficiency. It was a smart frame. Efficiency sounds like fairness when you say it fast. The president asked for responses. A woman in the second row stood and said the new process had handled her landscaping issue in 1 day, which was faster than the old way. A man near the aisle said at least now he knew what rule he was accused of breaking before he had to defend himself. Mike raised his hand and said he had watched what happened with the tow, and that it was the first time he had felt like the HOA acted with neighbors, not against them. The room hummed with small agreements. Then I stood and walked to the microphone with my one-page summary in my pocket and my timeline folder under my arm. I kept my voice level and I kept it short. I said I supported speed where safety was at stake, but that speed without accuracy was how we ended up towing a personal truck without notice and trying to order another tow with a blank form. I said the new process wasn't designed to protect me. It was designed to protect whoever found themselves standing where I had stood 2 months ago. I held up the timeline and said anyone who wanted a copy could have one. Then I looked at the board and asked if I could play a brief audio clip from the tow yard to clarify how the last unauthorized request had happened. The president consulted the board and nodded. I pressed play, and the room filled with the sound of a polite employee explaining policy, while a familiar voice on the other end insisted on immediate removal and threatened escalation. I let it run just long enough to establish the facts. Then I stopped it. I didn't look at Karen. I looked at the neighbors who were listening with their heads tilted and their brows knit like people measuring something that matters. Karen stepped back to the microphone and called it character assassination. She said the clip was taken out of context and that everyone knew I was the owner of the company and had orchestrated the entire scene to make her look reckless. I didn't take the bait. I simply said the driver had the form in his hand when he arrived, and the form lacked required information, and that any vendor in this county would have refused it. The consultant tried to shift the focus to liability exposure from slow response times. The treasurer answered that the committee had built an expedited track for true hazards, and that it had been used twice already with same-day resolution. Facts are quiet, but they work like water on fire. Verification of the petition signatures began, and this was where the turn really started. The secretary read names while another board member cross-checked them against the homeowner roster. Within minutes, a pattern emerged. 2 names belonged to tenants, not owners. 3 names didn't match any address in the subdivision. 1 owner's name appeared twice with 2 different signatures. Murmurs lifted and rolled. The president paused and asked for patience while they continued the check. Karen spoke up quickly, saying there must have been a clerical error and that the intent of the signers should be respected. The secretary kept reading. By the end of the list, the petition was short of the threshold, even before questions of validity were addressed. The president announced that based on the verification, the recall would not proceed. Karen flashed anger, then smoothed it away, but the room had already seen it. I thought that would be the end of the night, but one of the older residents asked to speak and the board allowed it. He walked slowly to the microphone and said he had watched this neighborhood grow from empty lots to the place it was now, and that he had seen good rules used badly and bad rules used as excuses. He said the new process was not about any one person. It was about a community deciding to slow down just enough to tell the difference between a real problem and a personal opinion. When he finished, people clapped, not loud but long. After the meeting, I stepped into the hallway as neighbors filed past. Several asked for the timeline, and I handed it over until my folder was empty. The consultant gave me a level look and said efficiently managed associations avoid personalities and stick to policy. I smiled and said that was exactly what we were doing. Karen brushed past without stopping. Out in the parking lot under the lights, she confronted the president and the treasurer, and the conversation got tight and sharp but quiet. I did not move closer. I had done my part. When I got home, the street felt different again. Not just watchful now, but lighter. Neighbors lingered in driveways, talking softly. Mike texted a simple, "We did it," and I answered, "We did the work." I sat on my porch steps and looked at the cameras and thought about turning them off for a night, but left them on because rituals keep you honest. The next morning, an email went out from the board thanking residents for attending and summarizing the verification results. It noted the invalid signatures and reaffirmed the committee process. It also announced an audit of recent enforcement actions to ensure consistency going forward. That last piece surprised me and pleased me because it meant this was not just about defending the current way, it was about improving it. Around noon, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, Karen stood there with no phone in sight. For the first time since this started, she looked tired, not angry. She asked if we could talk without recording. I said yes, and stepped onto the porch. She said the petition had been sloppier than she wanted, and that some people helping her had cut corners. She did not say sorry. She did say she thought I was dangerous to the neighborhood because I made people think they could push back on enforcement. I told her pushing back against bad enforcement was the point, and that good enforcement didn't need fear to work. We stood in that quiet for a moment. Then she said the board would regret sidelining her, and that there were other ways to guide a community. I said I hoped those ways included listening. She left without answering. That evening, the committee met to start the audit. We pulled a sample of complaints from the last year and looked at outcomes. A pattern appeared quickly. Anonymous complaints had spiked around certain homes and then vanished after compliance. The addresses lined up almost perfectly with people who had spoken against Karen at earlier meetings and with people who had attended fewer HOA events. It was not proof of origin, but it was a shape you could see without squinting. We documented it and agreed to recommend a ban on anonymous submissions entirely. Names and addresses required. Evidence attached. No exceptions. When I got home after the audit meeting, a small envelope waited on my mat. Inside was a single key on a ring with a label that read Clubhouse Storage. No note. I held it up and thought about who had access to that room and what was inside it. Old records boxes, extra signs, folding tables. I texted the treasurer a photo and asked if the board had sent keys out. She replied no, and asked me to bring it to the clubhouse in the morning. For a moment I wondered if this was a trap or a gift or a test. Then I set the key on the counter and poured a glass of water. Whatever it was, it could wait until daylight. I slept deeper than I had in weeks and woke to a quiet that felt earned. The street was just a street again, cars in driveways, sprinklers ticking, kids waiting for a bus. I drove to the clubhouse with the key in my pocket and met the treasurer at the door. When we opened the storage room, dust lifted in slow motes through the beam of her flashlight. We checked the shelves and found nothing obvious, missing or out of place. Then on the floor behind a stack of folding chairs, we found a shallow box of paper, forms the old complaint templates with blanks for anonymous submissions, and a rubber stamp with the HOA logo worn smooth from use. The treasurer stared at the box and then at me. She said these should have been destroyed when we updated the process. I said maybe someone kept them as a shortcut. She locked the box in her car and said she would bring it to the board office. We did not guess out loud who had left the key on my mat. We didn't need to. On the way home, I felt something ease in my chest. Turning the tables had not felt like a victory lap. It felt like building a better table and inviting everyone to sit where the light was good and the rules were written in ink big enough to read. I pulled into my driveway and shut off the engine and listened to the echo fade, and I realized I was smiling without noticing. The fight wasn't over. People like Karen rarely quit. They simply change routes. But now the routes were narrower and the signs were clearer, and the neighborhood had learned the difference between noise and signal. I gathered the last timelines from the passenger seat and carried them inside, ready for whatever the final act would bring. 3 days after the key turned up, I started noticing the shift. Not in Karen exactly, but in the rhythm of the neighborhood. The cars moved slower past my house. The small groups talking at the mailboxes stopped mid-sentence when I walked up, and then started again when I left. It wasn't all cold shoulders, but it wasn't the easy nods I had been getting for weeks either. Mike noticed it too when we grabbed coffee at the corner shop. He said, word was, Karen was telling people I had broken into HOA storage and stolen records. I laughed because it was so far from the truth, but I also knew that rumors didn't need truth to work, they just needed repetition. That night I called the treasurer and told her what Mike had heard. She said the board had already secured the storage key and documented the discovery of the old forms. She said they were being shredded tomorrow. She also said she'd speak up if anyone questioned where the key came from. I thanked her and hung up feeling steadier but still alert. The next morning my cameras caught a man I didn't know, walking slowly past my driveway taking photos of my truck from multiple angles. He wore a baseball cap low and kept glancing up and down the street. I stepped outside and asked if I could help him. He said he was just admiring the paint job and kept walking. 15 minutes later, a complaint hit the committee inbox, claiming my truck exceeded width limits for residential vehicles. I measured it in my driveway before I even sat down with coffee. It was well under the limit by 3 inches. We responded the same day with photos and measurements and marked it closed. By Thursday, I was expecting another swing, and it came in the form of a notice from the City Code office. Someone had filed a report that I was running a business from my home in violation of zoning. The inspector showed up that afternoon, and I walked him through my garage and driveway, showing him there was no equipment, no office setup, nothing beyond a personal truck parked like any other. He signed off on the spot, but said it was the 3rd similar complaint they had received about me in the last year. 2 were anonymous, and 1 was from the HOA before the new process. He shook his head and said some neighbors just can't let go. Friday night, I decided to host another small cookout, not as a statement, but as a reminder that this street was still a place where people could talk without an agenda. The turnout was smaller than the last time, but the conversations felt easier. One neighbor told me straight up that she'd been hesitant to come because she didn't want to be seen as picking a side. I told her the only side I wanted her on was the side of common sense. She laughed and stayed for a burger. Around 9, as people were heading out a car I didn't recognize idled at the far end of the street with its lights off. The cameras picked it up clearly. 2 figures sat inside watching the last guests leave. They didn't move until I walked halfway toward them with my phone up recording. Then the headlights snapped on and they drove off without a word. The plate came back to a rental car when I ran it through a friend who worked in the county system. That told me nothing except someone wanted to hide their connection. Saturday morning, the HOA forum lit up with a new thread from a user who had never posted before. They claimed the compliance committee was biased and cited my truck as proof of selective enforcement. Within an hour, the post had replies both defending and attacking me. I answered once with the facts and then muted the thread. By now, I knew when to walk away before a conversation turned into a bonfire. The next committee meeting was Monday evening. On the agenda was the official recommendation to ban anonymous complaints. We presented the data from the audit, showing the pattern of clustering and the lack of supporting evidence in most anonymous cases. The board voted to adopt the recommendation on the spot. That meant every complaint now had to carry a name and an address. It also meant one of Karen's favorite tools had just been locked away for good. After the vote, I caught Karen watching me from the back of the room. Her expression wasn't anger this time, it was calculation. I knew that look well enough by now to understand she was already mapping her next approach. The difference was that now every path she chose would be visible and tied to her name. That didn't make her harmless, but it did make her slower. The rest of the week passed without a single new complaint against me. It felt almost unnatural. Then Saturday afternoon, while I was changing the oil in my truck, the Maple camera pinged. It was Karen walking with another neighbor toward my driveway. They stopped just outside the property line and spoke for a while, gesturing toward my truck and the cameras. Then they left without knocking. 2 hours later, the neighbor she'd been with emailed the committee a question about whether HOA funds could be used to hire a third party to review committee decisions. It wasn't a complaint, just a feeler. But it told me she was still trying to plant seeds. That night, I walked the block myself, not knocking on doors, just being seen. I waved to everyone I passed and talked about the weather and the game on TV. Sometimes the best move is to be present without pushing. By the time I got home, I felt the air between houses was a little clearer. Sunday evening, I was grilling on the back patio when the president called. He said a resident had come forward privately with information about the flyers and the petition signatures. They had proof that multiple names had been added without permission and that some addresses had been pulled from an outdated HOA roster that wasn't supposed to be in circulation. He said the board would review it at the next meeting and decide whether to take formal action. I asked if I could see the proof and he said not yet, but soon. After I hung up, I sat with that for a long time, watching the last of the coals fade to grey. If the board had evidence of forgery or misuse of records, then this was bigger than just me and Karen. It was about trust in the whole system. And trust once cracked takes a long time to mend. Later that night, I checked the cameras one more time before bed. The street was quiet. No slow cars, no shadows in hoodies, no clipboard walks. Just the ordinary stillness of a Sunday before a work week. But I knew that calm wouldn't hold. The next meeting could decide whether Karen still had any foothold left, or whether she'd be facing consequences beyond a censure. And if that happened, I had no doubt she would come out swinging one last time. The night of the final board meeting came with the kind of heavy, still air that makes voices carry farther than they should. The clubhouse lot was already full when I arrived. Cars lined both sides of the street, and clusters of neighbors stood outside, talking in low tones. Inside the board table was stacked with folders, and a single manila envelope in the center, like the centerpiece no one wanted to admit was there. The treasurer gave me a small nod as I took a seat near the front. Karen was on the opposite side of the room, back straight eyes, fixed forward phone in her hand but not recording yet. The president opened the meeting by thanking everyone for coming and stating the first agenda item was the review of new evidence regarding petition signatures and the use of outdated HOA records. He opened the manila envelope and pulled out a short typed statement from a resident who had asked to remain off the record publicly but had provided documentation to the board. The statement described how they had been approached to sign the petition but declined only to later find their name listed on it. It also detailed how an old contact list with full names and addresses had been used to fill in blanks where the petitioner hadn't gotten enough actual signatures. Attached were copies of the outdated roster and the petition pages showing the matching handwriting in several places. The president said the board had verified that the outdated roster matched one set of old files that should have been destroyed when member information was updated the year before. He said these files had been stored in the clubhouse storage room, and that access to that room was limited to a small number of people. The treasurer added that the key found on my doorstep matched the clubhouse lock, and that the old anonymous complaint forms had been found in the same room. A quiet settled over the room like a blanket. Karen finally spoke, saying there was no proof she had taken the records and no proof she had altered signatures. She said anyone could have left that key, and that this was a coordinated attempt to smear her. Her voice was firm, but it carried a thin edge of strain. The president didn't argue. He simply said the board would vote on whether the petition and the manner it was circulated violated HOA policy and whether further action was warranted. Before the vote, he opened the floor to residents. Several people spoke about the importance of protecting member privacy and how they felt betrayed learning their names and addresses could be misused. One man said his elderly mother had been pressured into signing something she didn't understand. Another resident said she'd been avoiding HOA meetings for years because she feared being targeted, but had hoped the new process would change that. She said learning about the petition made her feel like those old fears were justified. When my turn came, I stood and kept it short. I said my involvement here wasn't about winning arguments, it was about making sure the rules worked for everyone equally. I said, misuse of records wasn't just an HOA issue, it was a trust issue, and trust doesn't come back easy once it's broken. I didn't look at Karen when I sat down. I looked at the board. The board went into a brief closed session, while the rest of us waited in the hall. The air outside the meeting room was a mix of tension and quiet conversation. Mike stood beside me and said this was it. Either they were going to shut it down or they weren't. When the door opened, the president called us back in. He announced that the board had voted unanimously to invalidate the petition and to issue a formal reprimand to Karen for actions that violated the HOA Code of Conduct. He said she would be barred from holding any HOA leadership position for a minimum of 2 years, and that her access to HOA storage and records was permanently revoked. He added that all member information would be resecured, and a new policy would require 2 board members present for any access to stored records. A wave of murmurs rolled through the room. Some people looked relieved. Others looked stunned. Karen stayed very still. Her phone screen lit up once, then went dark again. She didn't speak. When the meeting adjourned, neighbors drifted out in small groups. Some came to me with quiet words of thanks. Others just nodded as they passed. Mike clapped me on the shoulder and said it might finally be over. I told him maybe, but I wasn't counting on quiet, lasting forever. Outside in the lot, Karen was standing by her car talking to the two consultants she'd brought weeks earlier. Her voice was low and her gestures sharp. When she saw me, she stopped talking and got in her car without another word. The consultants followed her lead. Driving home, I realized my shoulders had dropped for the first time in months. I parked in my driveway and just sat there a minute, listening to the engine tick cool. The cameras blinked their steady green, and for once it didn't feel like they were my first line of defense. It felt like they were just there in case. The next morning I woke to sunlight spilling across the kitchen table. No alerts. No new complaints. Just quiet. I took my coffee to the porch and watched a couple of kids ride bikes down the street with no glances over their shoulders. The air smelled like cut grass and someone's breakfast toast. For the first time since that first orange slip, I let my mind wander to things beyond this fight. Projects at the shop. Maybe a short trip out of town. By midday, I'd gotten 2 texts from neighbors asking about the new security policies for HOA records, and I explained them simply: no anonymous complaints, no single-person access, no shortcuts. Both said they felt better knowing that. That evening, Mike came over, and we sat on the porch talking about everything except the HOA. It felt strange but good, like a chapter turning. Before he left, he asked if I thought Karen would keep pushing from the sidelines. I said probably, but now every move would be under light, and rules she couldn't bend alone. And that was enough for me. When the sun set and the street lamps clicked on, I looked at my truck in the driveway and thought about that first morning when it was lifted onto the tow bed with Karen watching from the sidewalk. Back then I decided not to stop it because I wanted the truth to play out where everyone could see it. Months later, the truth had done its work. The rules were stronger, the board was awake, and the neighborhood knew the difference between leadership and control. I turned off the porch light and stepped inside. The cameras would still blink through the night, but tonight they were more like insurance than armor. I didn't need to watch every shadow anymore. If something came, I'd be ready. But for now, I could let the quiet be just quiet. The fight was over, at least for this round, and I'd won it without towing a single neighbor's car. Which for a towing company owner felt like the best possible ending.